lunchtime, everyone. And I'd like to start off by thanking the OCGS for allowing me to give this presentation. My only disappointment is I'm not getting any lunch to go with it. Hopefully, everyone got to see the abstract which went out with the initial announcement. So what I'm going to be talking about is purely geochemistry and its applicability in how we approach unconventional plays, particularly and specifically best practices in fluid contribution studies and time-lapse geochemistry or production monitoring. Depends what terminology you prefer. So I want to emphasize, I can't actually see the questions or the people. I only have one screen in front of me. So Mallory will compile them, and I'll hopefully get a whole bunch to answer by the time I'm finished. This is going to be a tour de force of geochemistry. In an ideal world, this would be several hours long. I could fit in everything and provide a good understanding, lots of examples, and go through all the points which I'd love to make. But time is limited, and I wouldn't want to ruin everyone entirely. So I'm going to start off by briefly giving an introduction to reservoir geochemistry, some of the basic terminology and where the applicability is. So what are we using this data for? What should you be looking to answer with this type of information? Building upon that, I'll move into what we consider best practices for these plays. So what do you really need to think about? What do you need to understand? What questions do you need to bear in mind before you start one of these programs? And along with that, what are the caveats that need to be well understood when you get this data back, when you look at these interpretations of what your results are telling you about your system? And this can be any lab, any interpreter. This is across the board. And then once we've gone through, and I mean, that's really the meat of the topic. But once we've gone through that, I'll move on to an example case study that we have from the Delaware Basin. And we're going to go from start to finish and go through what we learned during this case study, what it told the operator, and what it indicated about what you can and can't do with this type of work. And we're lucky we're able to talk about that study. We can give all the context, all the wells, all the information, which is somewhat of a rarity. And I've mentioned it briefly in previous talks I've given, but I've never given the full context or the full set of rounds, which were only recently completed. But that's where we'll end up. Hopefully by the time we get there, you'll all be able to take away at least some piece of information, some utility you can use in what you're doing with your work in the industry. So when we talk about reservoir geochemistry, and if you ask two geochemists, you may very well get two different answers, if not three different answers. But it's really a catch-all term. And the way we're talking about it is we are moving from an exploration setting into a production setting, particularly when we're talking about this unconventional work. And it encompasses a number of things. Primarily for unconventional work, what it really focuses upon is production allocation. So assigning contributions to potential sources, or really defined sources, which are generating the fluid which you are producing from your wells, and time-lapse geochemistry. That terminology is relatively new, and my preference is to refer to it as production monitoring as such. So really, in that case, you are looking at the same well, more than likely a number of wells from a number of formations, and you're looking at them through time. It depends on the project, depends on the context, depends on the basin, what that time scale is, how much sampling you do. My advice is always, and always will be, that it's better to sample more and analyze less, because if you have the samples, you see differences as you move through this type of work. If you have the samples, you can always go back through and look at the samples you have in-house and get that information. Additionally, there's a number of other concepts which filter into reservoir geochemistry in general: oil characterization, core extract analysis, core to oil correlations, which we'll mention as we go through this to some extent, but it won't be the overall focus of what we're talking about here. And the purpose of this is when you need to optimize production, or you need to answer questions related to poor performance, either in a particular target zone or specific wells. Reservoir geochemistry can provide the answers to that. It can provide assistance to what's going on, and it can help you better design a successful project. And the graph on the right I borrowed from my colleague Katie Donoghue, who I'm sure borrowed it from someone else. And it emphasizes that really what operators want is to move those curves to the left. You want to increase your cumulative production over the shortest timescale. You want to maximize what you can produce. And those earlier curves, the yellow curves, the red curves, they are often based upon when you initially get the acreage, when you have limited information. And the blue curves are that more accurate, more optimized production based upon what you've managed to gather from your reservoir geochemistry. And ideally, and especially in the current climate, you want a program that meets your needs, but it's also as cost effective as you can manage. And it is nice to say that geochemistry is generally on the cheaper side of things when it comes to this sort of understanding. So briefly, if we talk about production allocation, if we use the terminology production allocation, it goes back more than about 30 years. And really, it was applied early on, initially to North Slope, Alaska. But there is a huge breadth of literature out there which covers all of the major basins from a global standpoint. There's lots of different workers, operators, and labs producing on this sort of thing. The method itself, although not simple, is relatively straightforward in how it is applied. And the great benefit for these earlier studies, and the one massive benefit to these earlier studies in conventional systems, because that's where this was developed in a conventional setting, is that you have reliable end members, or certainly much more reliable end members. That is a rarity in unconventional systems. So if you have discrete and distinct end members that you assume are not changing, if you have a strong assumption or strong understanding that your system is relatively homogeneous, and you have at least a limited set of analytical geochemistry to play about with, and more often than not, the favored technique for this is high resolution gas chromatography, and it's very useful, very crucial data for any of these studies. If you have that information, then unmixing of fluids and contribution determination is relatively straightforward. I'll talk about some of the algorithms and some of the processes for that in a few slides' time, but that's not the complicated bit. The mathematics with those assumptions are easy. The problem with unconventional plays is that points 1 and 2, your end members and your homogeneity, are generally absent. And don't take my word for it. I'm going to show you some data to back this up from a couple of plays that we've looked at. But even across the numerous projects we've been involved with over the last few years, that is the normal situation. and it is not overly surprising. In addition to points 1 and 2 being an issue, replication of point 3 can be hit or miss. Relying purely on GC data, it is possible to do this type of work, depending upon what the exact objectives are, depending upon the play you're working in, and depending upon the acreage and the samples you have. There are a lot of similarities in organophages between many of the target zones in the most prolific plays we're looking at in the US. So separation is not easy, and our preference is generally, certainly early on in these projects, to try and throw the kitchen sink at it. And throw the kitchen sink at the fluids. And I'm going to emphasize as I go through continually the produced fluids. They are the key to what we're trying to do in this type of work. So as I said, reservoir geochemistry and unconventional plays tends to be a mixture of fingerprinting, time-lapse studies, and production allocation. Depends where you are in the project, depends what you're up to and what the overall objectives are. Generally, the goals starting off are as follows. What you want to do is identify your landing zones, because the operator knows where they've landed, or they have a very good idea where they've landed. But the geochemistry should tell you if you're actually producing from where you think you are landed. And are you producing just from that zone or further afield? And that filters into the next objective, providing estimates of the drained rock volume. How much of your landing zone is being produced? Are there discrete zones within, say, the formation you're looking at, say within the Wolfcamp Bay? And are we looking at discrete fluids that we can really work with and understand and try and pull out potential commingling contributions? And then ultimately, and this is the goal, the overall goal for all of this work, is to optimize your well spacing. I mean, more often than not, is how many wells can I stick in the ground to produce as much oil as possible. But really what you want to do is maximize your production from the individual zones without stealing fluid from adjacent zones, without reducing the lifetime, the production capacity, and the profitability of your wells. And that takes adaptation of your well spacing. And the reservoir geochemistry helps fill in the information you need to do that. And the diagram on the right is just a basic example of what we're talking about in unconventionals and laterals. I have far more interesting and pertinent ones as we move on. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's a number of considerations we need to take into account before we start our reservoir geochemistry program. A number of caveats we want to appreciate. And the number one point is production oils are king. They are the key to what you are doing. Cuttings and core samples from your target zones, yes, they are extremely useful. They provide information on core to oil correlation assessments, so you can understand what the linkage between your target zone and your produced oil is. But using them as end members for allocation is problematic. I'm going to show some examples of why that is as we move on. But basically where you end up is you either have to have a significant fudge factor, and you probably have to have that anyway, but the error on it is going to be significant. And in many cases, the error there is going to be largely an unknown factor. I have some diagrams to explain how this works in the next couple of slides. So produced oil is what you want to work for. It's what's coming out the ground. You should be looking for changes in those fluids, differences in those fluids, the relationship between the fluids in those wells as your starting position. And down here we have a bunch of oils for the Delaware project I'm going to talk about. And on the next slide I'm going to talk about good techniques for sampling oils and why these are perhaps not ideal examples of how you should be collecting fluids. It always boggles my mind why, when you're producing so much oil from all these wells, you only manage to send a small amount for us to work with. And it's not like we need much anyway. And finishing off on this, not so much a case in core samples, but certainly in cuttings, if that is the route you're going to go down. Oil-based drilling mud is a problem for organic geochemistry. Unsurprisingly, it's in the name, oil-based drilling mud. We can get around this, as I said, in core cuttings, not so much so. It's pretty pervasive. And even if you have water-based drilling mud, quite often there's additives which can be significantly problematic in high-res GC data and potentially in the biomarkers in some cases, because you can get a lot of mixes of those additives. Basically, use your data appropriately and work with what you have. So if we think about oils, good results start in the field. You got to think about collection, transportation, storage, and surprisingly, even labeling. See if you can't get that step right, you're going to have problems achieving a successful result to your program. All of those things are the starting point. One of the problems for us, especially in unconventional oils, which tend to be relatively light, excessive headspace means that all of your light end peaks are moving from the fluid into the headspace. We've done numerous tests in the lab to show this. As you add headspace to the oil, what happens is your light end peaks get smaller and smaller. Now, that may not be a huge issue for many analytical protocols you use, but it will have a knock-on effect on the bulk parameters. It will have a knock-on effect, certainly in the gasoline range GC parameters. And actually, it has some of a knock-on effect on the heavier parameters. It means where you can start to use the fluid for your comparative interpretive work is far more reduced. Don't wrap the inside thread with Teflon tape. So your oil samples are not your irrigation system in your garden. You want to wrap the Teflon tape around the outside of your sampling jar. Why? Because if you wrap it on the inside, what often happens is these samples get jiggled about in transport is the Teflon ends up dipping in the oil and it acts like a wick and it starts to leak outside your bottle. So always wrap around the outside. Label the vials effectively with all of the relevant context. So if you are doing a time-lapse study and you're looking at the same well over a number of days, weeks, months, then you're going to have samples with all the same well name. So you need to have dates on there, context for the lab to understand what's going on. And the naming system for all these wells in the Permian and the likes is very similar on pads and in acreage. So quite often it's only one digit which is changing. So it becomes problematic if that is badly labeled. So bear it in mind. And I'm emphasizing all these points because these are some of the most important to take home when you're first thinking about collecting samples. And this is not targeted at anyone because we get lots of samples in the door like this. Never write on the collection bottles with a Sharpie, because if you have any fluid leakage, if there's any solvent kicking about, you're going to lose a lot of the information on your bottle. And if you lose that information, it's very difficult to be entirely confident about what we're saying and how we're interpreting the data. Quite often what happens is we run the geochemistry and there are additional wells associated with the one which is missing the information, and we type it and tell them actually what well it came from based upon that information. That shows the great power of geochemistry, but it can be a bit problematic for us. And here is an ideal example of what an oil should look like coming into the lab. I mean, that's only 20 mils, so it's not a huge amount. Teflon tape around the outside, no headspace, or minimal headspace. If you leave a small bit in case it expands, you want to break the cap. So that's what you're looking for. And if you start with that, then you have the greatest chance of success moving forward. So, moving beyond the oils being king, what is another consideration to bear in mind? Well, as I mentioned this earlier on, end members are problematic. True production fluid end members are the holy grail. But true representative end members in these systems is largely impossible to collect. You might ask why. Well, there's a number of reasons. Generally, you're getting the fluid after hydraulic fracturing, so any mixing as a result of that process is going to be happening as you're collecting the oil. So you struggle to determine whether you have some ingress or not. That's why you're going to look at the samples through time and hope that any mixing is reduced. You also have within target zone lateral and stratigraphic fluid variations. And I'm going to show some of that data as we move on, but it's well reported in the literature. So where do you select your end member from? In addition to that, we know we have organofascia changes, we know we have migration, we know we have geologic mixing, potentially related to fluid conduits, bringing fluid from deeper potential target zones. All of this conspires against us. So the diagram on the right is an ideal world where we have a nice homogeneous end member or a red paint, we've got another homogeneous end member or a yellow paint, we mix them, voila, we can determine what those contributions are. We don't tend to see that in unconventional systems. You should really be assuming that you have at least a range of potential signatures as your end member cloud, for example. And I'll talk about that some more in the slides that follow. So this is just a brief example that I borrowed from Geomark's Wolfcamp study that John Zumberg let me use. And it's TOC and pyrolysis data for a lateral in the Lee CJ State 27 well. It's Wolfcamp A. So our top diagram here is the vertical, and this is the horizontal. So this is the lateral we're interested in. This is hydrogen index. And what we're looking at here is particularly this information. As we move across our lateral, it's not all the same. Our percentage carbonate, our hydrogen index, our TOC are highly variable. So it shows we have heterogeneity in that aspect. The thermal maturity calculated from the Tmax is here, and there is some variability, but it's certainly not as prominent as the other parameters, which actually is what we would also expect. But all of those variations indicate that laterally you have fascist variation within the Wolfcamp A. So if you decided you were going to do some detailed geochemistry to try and understand potential allocation assessments and core samples where your preferred choice to do that, where would you pick from? What would be the ideal sample which is going to help us understand what's going on? It's the problem, or it's the ideal problem where you have no wrong answers, because, and I'll show this from slides coming on as well, you could take the average, you could take the median, you could take the one with the most distinct geochemical signature, you could take the one closest to the target zone. None of those are wrong answers, and we've worked with people who use various approaches in that respect. But the problem is none of them are the right answer either. That's not really where the question should be going. So if we ignore that for a second and assume that we have a perfectly homogeneous system, so all of our laterals, we are fairly confident that we are looking at a homogeneous geochemical signature through our different target zones. And here we have 3 target zones, A, B, and C. With that information, and the programs and software at our fingertips, we can define 3 very good geochemical end members. From those geochemical end members, if we have wells which produce between them, the mathematics, the modeling is straightforward. I can tell you what the contribution is. And I can tell you what the contribution is to a relatively tight value. So this is an example building upon the previous slide. So we have 3 oils, which we have mixed in-house. And they are from the Monterey, Tuscaloosa Shale, and Bakken. You might say, well, they're never going to mix together. This was an example just to provide data to show what is feasible for doing these type of contribution assessments and assignments. So mathematically, it's straightforward. 2 of the most common methods that are used are called alternating least squares and partial least squares. But there are other models, there are other algorithms, there's other software for doing unmixing. And what we have in each one of these diagrams here refers to each one of the individual oils. The blue line is the known amount which is contributing. And the red line is what our software has told us the mix amount is. And I could actually have refined this even further. In this case, what we're looking at is deviations generally of from about 5% of the known value. There's a couple which are slightly larger than that, but we worked with Scott Ramos, Infometrics, to develop a model for this. And once, what you would do is you would do this the first time around, you can see your end members, you tell the software, okay, these are our end members, and it tightens up how your separations occur. So you might be looking at close to 2% of the known value. But bear in mind, this is assuming a perfect system. It's assuming a nice homogeneous system. So mathematics is easy. The modeling is straightforward. And we can end up with good contribution assignments. But is it geologically realistic? Is it what would be actually happening in our plays where we're working? So taking my perfect homogeneous diagram and saying, well, what if it's not perfectly homogeneous? What if what we're seeing is significant organosphecies variation and thermal maturity variation as we move laterally and stratigraphically across our target zones? And here what you end up with is, rather than 3 discrete points to work with, you end up with a cloud of potential end member signatures, all of which represent that particular target zone, that particular discrete fluid. Produced fluids I'm comfortable with. The problem with core, and the reason I mentioned core again here, is if you're going to use that for your end member, you have the additional complexity of the further you move away from your core, you just have an ever increasing unknown factor, an unknown geochemical difference from that starting point. And even that in itself assumes that the fluid or the well producing closest to the core is going to be represented by the signature in that core. That's not necessarily the case either. A lot of complexities, a lot of dynamism in these systems. It makes you end up with the question as, what is the initial error range on each of our proposed end members? What value do you use? So as I said before, you can take the median, the average, closest to the target zone, the most geochemically distinct. You'll have your geochemical interpreter, your consultant, look at this information and make the best case argument for what you should be using. And again, as I said, there are no wrong answers, but there are no right answers, because each one can be valid depending on what you're trying to do. And then it ends up with what is an acceptable range. And when does the very idea of quantification, contribution assignment become meaningless in these systems? And again, it comes back to what the overall objectives of the study and the program are. You can get a huge amount of geochemistry beyond that from quantified contribution assignment. And I'm not saying not to do it. What I'm merely saying is just bear in mind what it is actually telling you. So I have beat down on core and cutting samples already, but that's not to say I don't like them. I certainly use them. And the case study I'll talk about has core samples which provide very insightful information as to what is going on. So primarily, they've been used throughout the literature for core to oil correlation, helping to ascertain the source of your produced oil. We've done it for dozens, hundreds of studies over the years. But one of the things to bear in mind, and sometimes it seems to get lost in the literature, is that produced oil and extracted fluids are not the same. And the way that we extract fluids, whether it be thermal, solvent, supercritical CO2, pick your poison, it doesn't matter. They don't match the geologic processes that generate and expel these produced oils. So you should take a bit of a careful look when you're using that data. Don't overinterpret what you have. And it really feeds into the fact that like for like comparison between core cuttings to oil is problematic, particularly in allocation, particularly where you need to define end member points in space. And as I said in the last slide, just because your core extract is adjacent to your well doesn't mean they're directly comparable. That's an oversimplification of the system. So core and cuttings data have their place, and they are very useful, and we encourage their use for a lot of these studies, but use them appropriately and don't try to fit a square peg into a round hole. Using these for allocation, if you do it, you want to just consider all the implications of doing so. And the last thing on what you should be considering is there's a number of scales. So as geologists, as I assume all, if not most of you are, we are always used to looking at different scales, whether it be thin section, hand specimen, outcrop, regional. The same applies when you're doing these types of studies. You want to assess on the well-to-well scale, the pad scale, the regional scale. Each one of those data sets provides valuable information on what's going on in your system as a whole, and it will give you valuable information about how you go about your development. The most crucial in my eyes being well-to-well assessment, and this will become increasingly apparent as we go through the case study data, and in fact the next slide, because in many cases each of these wells should be considered their own island. And all of the changes you're looking for are on a well-to-well basis. Yes, you want to feed it into the overall story of what's happening across your formation, but you don't want to forget what's happening in those individual wells on their own. And a lot of the changes that you'll see, a lot of the contributions and statistically significant shifts are associated with looking at those wells discretely. And this diagram at the bottom, this is just upwelling biomarkers for some of the oils we'll talk about in the case study. And it's Bone Spring Shale, Wolfcamp A, Wolfcamp B. And these 15 wells are replicated across all 3 rounds. And what we're looking to see, just from a general perspective in a bivariate crossplot, is they're all showing the same trend. Now, they're not all identical between rounds, and it begs the question whether you would expect them to be identical between rounds or not. Depends on the geochemist you would ask. But consider that in mind as we move forward into the case study. So the reason I always talk about well-to-well, pad, and regional assessments is this is an example data set from the Eagle Ford. I'm not going to say where. And it's 2 target zones in the lower Eagle Ford and 2 target zones in the upper Eagle Ford. And there are 4 pads. And I bet you can guess which ones are the individual pads. Each one of these represents the pads. So it's interesting. We have the same target zones, and we're looking at a spread here of, I think it's around about 8 miles. So it's not a huge distance. And yet, while we're seeing the same geochemical trend in the different formations as we move through these pads, we have significant variability, massive amounts of variability across a relatively small area. From the work we've done, there's a bit of organophasces, but largely thermal maturity variation across these target zones. And if you didn't view them on a pad-to-pad basis, if you didn't view them on a well-to-well basis, you would struggle to build your full understanding of what's going on. And we use all of the data in a full regional breakdown and understanding for the operator, because it all tells us something. It's all useful. But if you were going to stick a core in there, so say the question becomes, well, these oils look the same in the lower Eagleford zones, but different in the two upper Eagleford zones. Can the core help us to determine where the relationships and the linkages are? And the answer would be yes and no. The core will be useful for that, but it is going to have limited utility. Because if we use a core for this entire study, one core, then it's really only going to help us with a very limited geographical area. We would need to stick at least 4 cores down there to gather sufficient data, geochemical data, to do detailed correlations. And if you wanted to move into the realm of allocation, it would be even more problematic. So it becomes the question of whether, one, it would be even feasible to sink this number of core, which is unlikely. But more importantly, is it cost effective to do so given your objectives and the caveats and variabilities we understand in these systems? More than likely not. So core is useful, but has to be used appropriately and cost effectively. So those are the caveats. Those are the things you really need to consider when you are coming up with your reasons for doing these studies and the questions you want to answer at the end of the day. And these studies, and one of the things I really have to mention is it always comes out when talking to people who've done some of these in the past. They say, oh, the study wasn't a success. And the problem is success means different things to different people. Geochemical data is very, very useful. If you are targeting, say, a number of zones and all of the fluid geochemistry comes back and it's the same, it's very much telling you something. And it could be telling you a number of things. It could be telling you that due to geologic migration, mixing, you have a fluid which is all the same across those zones. It could also be telling you that your fracs are too large. And I've certainly worked on one project where we know we have 2 distinct producing zones, but the fluids generated from these particular wells are all the same. Why are they all the same? Because they know they're fracking across both zones. So you're getting mixing for that reason. There's more than one way to mix fluids. And some of that will come out in this Delaware study here. So we started this about 18 months ago. And it's 4 rounds of sampling across a period of 12 months. So there was an initial set sampling, and then 6 months later, we did the next round of sampling, and then every 3 months we sampled again. The initial sample set consisted of 15 produced oils from 15 different wells, and it covered the Bone Spring 2, the Wolfcamp A, and the Wolfcamp B formations. And the 15 wells are clustered in Winkler and Ward County, with a couple down here in the most southern area we have. Those were the initial 15. We did not use core material to start. Our preference is to do a baseline study of the oils. If you cannot determine differences between your produced oils, you might want to rethink how you're going to approach the project to understand your questions. Core may not be appropriate. The wells you're looking at might need to change. So always start with the produced oils. And I think I've said that so many times so far. But as I said, we do like core material. So in the second round, or at the same time as collecting the second round of samples, we got access to the core. And we decided we could take 15 subsamples from the whole core section, and I'll show you some of that data in a moment. And we extracted the fluids from there. And those 15 samples covered all of the formations that our wells were producing from, as well as the Bone Spring 3 and the Wolfcamp C. And it included samples from the formations around the target zones. Not just the target zone itself. We want to understand variability. Okay, we're looking at one core, so we're only going to see stratigraphic variability, but it helps us further our understanding about what sort of variability we're dealing with. And our analytical program, as I said, we like to start off by throwing the kitchen sink at it if we can. So if you have higher maturity fluids, then we would normally do bulk, GC, and QQQ analysis. If you have samples of slightly lower maturity, where traditional biomarkers are preserved, then we would do traditional GCMS biomarker work. We want to collect as much as possible to have the greatest chance of understanding these fluids. Bulk parameters, GC parameters, biomarker parameters, you're looking at a slightly different part of your oil. It's telling you a slightly different thing about what's going on. Link them all together and you get the real understanding of the fluid itself. So the first 15 oils all had biomarkers. As we extended into these other areas in the south and up in the north, they were a tad more thermally mature. Most of them lacked biomarkers, but we could build upon that given what we had from the other samples. So this is a cross-section. So I actually generated these in Trinity because it's wonderful for being able to look at your well distribution. So we have depth in feet on the left and TVD, and we have distance in miles along the bottom. And all of the samples are color-coded based upon the zones they are producing from. So green is Bone Spring 2, red is Wolfcamp A, and blue is Wolfcamp B. And then later on, we have a couple of purples, which are Wolfcamp C. And this one is somewhat problematic because they claim this one up here is above, and it's Wolfcamp C. I've still never solved that problem yet, although I can explain it later on. And we also have the Bone Spring 3, as I said. So this is our core. So we have a reasonable amount. But I mean, look at the variability as you move away from that core in terms of the depth, in terms of what other variables we're going to be pulling in our organophages, in our formations here, which might make things problematic. So what were the initial project objectives for these guys? And these apply across the board to most. So they wanted to know, are the fluids produced from the different target zones distinct from one another? So can I tell my Wolfcamp A from my Wolfcamp B and my Bone Spring 2? And do I see any differences, say, within the Wolfcamp A? Because I have more than one target zone in the Wolfcamp A. Can I tie my fluids back to the target zones geochemically? Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. Is there any evidence for mixing? So can I say I have development connectivity, or is it something else? And are additional rounds going to assist with the development of this field? Those were their initial questions. They're good questions to start with. So here is some initial baseline results. I could do an entire talk just looking at this case study because there's so many good geochemical results to play with. But I have to limit myself. So here's a few bivariate plot plots. This is isotopes, some of the gasoline range, heavier GC range, saturated aromatic ratio, and some of the upwelling biomarkers. And green is the Wolfcamp A, blue is Wolfcamp B, purple is the Bone Spring. And just glancing across this, you can see the different parameters are separating out some of these different fluids distinctly. So gasoline range, our Bone Spring looks distinct. In our isotopes, our Wolfcamp B looks pretty distinct. And down in pristine phytane and upwelling, we can certainly separate all three from the upwelling. Not overly surprising. You might say, well, what's going on in here? But it's a question for getting more data. And you might say what's going on in here, but that in itself is another story. Because one of those Bone Spring samples, the Sugarloaf 1H well, it's a bit of a oddball. Occasionally it plots with the other Bone Spring shale well, occasionally it doesn't, plots with the Wolfcamp A. It kind of moves about the data. So it's one worth looking into. And I wouldn't recommend just relying purely on crossplots. You want to look at the data in a much bigger way. Before we get that, the other well worth noting is this DYK1H well. It's a Wolfcamp A landed well, and in most cases, and it does cluster with the Wolfcamp A, but some cases it's moving towards the Wolfcamp B. It's not quite as distinct as the other Wolfcamp A samples. So maybe we have a couple of candidates for potential mixing just from our initial assessment. And we like doing statistical assessment. So this is a hierarchical cluster analysis, and this is principal component analysis. This is the scores graph, and this is the loadings. So these are all the parameters we've thrown in to create this and to generate this. So you can think of a hierarchical cluster analysis. If you ever did paleontology as an undergrad, I'm sure you had dendrograms where you generated trilobite families. It's pretty much the same thing, except we're using chemical parameters to generate those family trees. Depends who you talk to. Ken Peters likes the phrase tribes. We tend to use the phrase families. You can also use groups. It all means the same thing. And just looking at this, these are all our Wolfcamp A landed oils. Wonderful. They're all clustering together. These are our Bone Spring samples. Clustering together. Wolfcamp B. Clustering together. Excellent. And if you look at the PCA space, you have the same grouping. The only slight take home here is 15 samples is a small amount for statistical assessment. For statistics, you want as many samples as possible. It always makes it a bit better. And here's our Sugarloaf 1H well here. It's clustering with the Bone Spring samples, so this variability has not taken away that it has a signature akin to that other Bone Spring sample. And you can see it up here as well. So that makes us say, okay, what were our initial objectives? How many of them did we actually answer? Did we answer any of them? So are the fluids distinct from one another? Yes. I can at the very least say, I think you have a distinct Bone Spring, Wolfcamp A, and Wolfcamp B fluid. I could delve into it a bit more and maybe try and separate out some of your Wolfcamp A, but I'd be reluctant to do it so on just this data set. Plus, I never had that information when I worked on these samples originally. Can we tie our fluids back to the target zones? Given the data, it's not hard to assume that those fluid signatures are actually tying back to those landing zones. I mean, it would be hard to disagree with that assessment, but without core results, we can't really be quite so definitive. That's where core is useful for these correlations, not quantification, correlation. Is there evidence of mixing? We have two candidates. We have the Sugarloaf 1H and we have the DYK 1H. But statistically, they're grouping with the right landing zones. It's the bivariate crossplots which are saying there's something slightly screwy in here. So particularly in the 1H. And that's where we'd say, yes, we think there might be mixing, but we want to see more rounds of these fluids to confirm it. And that's where we say, yes, we want more rounds, because we want to see if the Wolfcamp A is stable in its signature, the Wolfcamp B, are the fluids in the Bone Spring moving? Is the DYK1H? Is it an outlier in this data? Is it going to suddenly clip back and join the rest of the Wolfcamp A samples? So, as I said, when it came to round 2, we also had access to core samples, so we could extract some fluids and do some correlation work. And these are the results across the core from Bone Spring 2, Bone Spring 3, Wolfcamp A, Wolfcamp B, Wolfcamp C, blue being the TOC and red being the S1. And then this is our S1 over TOC. And generally, and it depends which geochemist you talk to and which basin you're working in, but if you're over 100, 120 in that signature, generally you can consider the fluids or the zones to be oversaturated. Again, terminology varies depending upon who's talking, but these are all good target zones for producing oils, which in itself is very, very useful. Cuttings, core, providing the initial information for building the rest of our story. So what are the objectives with the core extracts? So first off, we want to determine if the variation we see in the oils is mimicked in the extracted fluids. Tied to that, we want to see if the produced oils correlate with the target zones they are landed in. Straightforward. And then we want to assess the viability of end member assignment, either from the core extracts, or if we find a produced, if we say, okay, this core extract is our end member, but we want a like-for-like comparison, the most appropriate equivalent would be this produced oil. That would be the better way of doing it. And that's quite often how we work if we go down that route. So this is the same diagrams, except we've added in more samples. So this is our hierarchical cluster analysis dendrogram. This is our PCA scores. This is our loadings. And the PCA here is only showing the core samples. And these are the core samples marked in black here. So this is our Wolfcamp A group. So our Wolfcamp C, our Bone Spring Shale, and our Wolfcamp B. Here's the Wolfcamp B core, Bone Spring core, Wolfcamp C core, Wolfcamp A upper core, and Wolfcamp A lower core. And if we look at our PCA, we see that we're starting to get groupings. We only really had one good Bone Spring Shale sample, so putting that circle is a bit of a, I mean, it's guesswork. But what we're generating here essentially is our source clouds, where we think if you land within that cloud, you are almost certainly producing predominantly that fluid within error. And I also mixed a sample in-house of one of the A and B oils, which in itself, it depends what oil you take and mix, where that would plot. They would roughly plot somewhere in here, but not necessarily exactly there, because if you use that one, or that one, or that one, you're going to get something slightly different if they were oils. So if we look at the produced oils, so now we've replaced the core with the oil samples. We can see we have one Bone Spring oil here into Bone Spring grouping. Most of our Wolfcamp A oils cluster in here. We have a bit of a couple of outliers here. But wait, that's our Sugarloaf 1H well, the one which we thought was potentially mixed. And that's our DYK 1H well, the other one which was potentially mixed. And look at it, it's sitting right next to my mixed AB oil. I mean, the chances of that were, well, I am amazed at my luck in that sense. And here's our Wolfcamp B oils, which are in the grouping here. What you should notice is this is your Wolfcamp B lower extract. These are your uppers. Now your oils cluster with the uppers. This is your upper in the lower. This is your Wolfcamp A upper over here, and this is your Wolfcamp A lowers. And again, the oils tend to cluster with the lowers. That may or may not be telling you a huge amount of information. It depends how much you trust a single extract, or even a number of extracts, to be definitive as to what's going on in your system. As you move to round 2, your Sugarloaf 1H well, that's the one that stands out the most interesting. It has moved from being a Wolfcamp A fluid to a Bone Spring fluid. So between rounds 1 and 2, you have had a statistically significant shift in your fluid geochemistry. In round 1, it was probably a mixture of Wolfcamp A and Wolfcamp B. In round 2, it's now in our eyes definitively Bone Spring Shale. Your DYK1H well, it's still clustering in this mix here. So if it is mixed, it's not changing. Not in the first 2 rounds. There's a bit of a shift in the Wolfcamp A and Wolfcamp B, but all of those oils stay within the same grouping. Much of that could be due to sampling, collection. There's a number of variabilities which would cause a slight offset. And statistically, they aren't moving. And even the fluids we see shifting in the Wolfcamp A, they're all moving between subgroups. And if you look in principal component space, in 2 dimensions, they're all virtually on top of one another. So a lot of these geochemical changes are happening in the 3rd, 4th, 5th dimension. And it's a tiny, tiny amount of the chemistry of this oil. It's not a statistically significant shift. And you can do further interpretation. You just got to be careful how far you take that. So, how many of our other questions can we answer now? Can we tie the fluids back to the target zones? Yes. The core extracts in the oils correlate nicely. Can we determine mixing? And in this case, yes, specifically the Sugarloaf 1H well, we know has to have almost certainly been a mix of Wolfcamp A and Bone Spring Shale in round 1, and is now dominantly Bone Spring Shale in round 2. DYK1H is still potentially mixed, still on the fence at this stage in the program about what it's telling us. In terms of the core extracts, do we see the same variation? Yes, yes we do. Do they correlate with the target zones they're landed in? Yes, yes they do. With the exception of the commingling and mixing, all the other fluids correlate nicely with their landing zones. Can we assess the viability of end member assignment? This is the one we always stumble upon. It's somewhat problematic. We have, just from looking at our HCA and our PCA, never mind the bivariate crossplots, quite a range of signatures. And if you assign one of those as the end member, that means all of your others are a mixture of more than one fluid, which is hard to justify in many cases. It's possible, but it's just as feasible to be a natural range in your organophases and your maturity across the lateral where you're producing from. And where would you stick your endpoints? Where would you stick your end members and be comfortable with the mathematics, or at least the end result of the mathematics? So my second last slide, so I'm almost finished, on the statistics and this project is really a summary, and it's a bit wordy, but this is all of the data we had. So on the left we have our hierarchical cluster analysis, which has all of the sufficiently low maturity oils and our core samples. And these are our PCA, and you can see it's a tad messier, but the groupings are still there. Our Bone Spring Shale, our Wolfcamp A, our Wolfcamp B. And after the 4th round of sampling, the same overall picture remains. But some finer nuances emerge. Bone Spring 2, Wolfcamp A, and Wolfcamp B remain distinct. We are comfortable with that. That is what we would say about those fluids. The Sugarloaf 1H well, which was mixed Bone Spring 2, Wolfcamp A in round 1, by the time you get to round 2, it is Bone Spring and source. And in rounds 3 and rounds 4, those fluids sit on top of one another. They have not changed. The Wolfcamp A, it is our most diverse, but bear in mind, it's also the one for which we have the most wells. We are covering a lot of different individual zones within the Wolfcamp A, and we're covering quite a distance in terms of geographic distribution. It's not a surprise that we would have a bigger variation there. And it's possible you could tie the oils to the upper and lower extracts, but the production zones don't fit in all cases, which in itself should raise a red flag. And there are other explanations which are possible. This is the Pashaka well. Round 1 it's here, round 2 it's here, round 3 it's here, round 4 it's here. In fact, just jumping about like that would suggest that you have a lot of similarities in this Wolfcamp A, and it's not necessarily indicating mixing between what would be considered discrete zones. It's also possible that all the fluids up here in the upper are actually just slightly higher maturity Wolfcamp A fluids, which pushes the biomarkers off ever so slightly. These are your lower maturity version. The DYK1H well, unlike the Sugarloaf 1H, it didn't shift back to being a dominantly Wolfcamp A well. It actually moved from Wolfcamp A in the statistics here in round 1 to a Wolfcamp B in rounds 2 and 3. Additionally, we added in the Yadin State well, which is also down in that direction, and it is landed in the Wolfcamp A, but it looks like a Wolfcamp B geochemical signature. So we have 2 wells landed in the Wolfcamp A, relatively stable, and producing what looks like, if not Wolfcamp B fluid, certainly something between Wolfcamp A and Wolfcamp B. And our belief, given our understanding of the geology, is this is not related to development. This is geologic migration. We have fluid conduits bringing Wolfcamp B fluid up in to this southerly area of our study area and mixing our fluids. So it's hardly a surprise there's some Wolfcamp A in there and a Wolfcamp B getting brought in. It shows the importance of understanding the dynamics and what's going on in these systems. You can have mixing for various different reasons, some development, some geologic, some potentially both. And bridging geochemistry with engineering, with production, with geology, helps to pull all that story together. And my last slide on this is what I class as my management slide, because I give these presentations to operators all the time, and generally they don't want to hear about a lot of the geochemistry. They want something they can show management, so management can understand what they've been told and how it works for those guys and how they're going to proceed with their development. So this is the cross-section from Trinity, and here I've given it essentially source clouds. So this is our Wolfcamp C production, which I didn't really talk about. This is our Wolfcamp B with our UL Kerwin, which is meant to be C, being B. This is our Wolfcamp A, and these are our higher maturity versions, which I managed to correlate. And again, I didn't have time to discuss in this particular presentation. And these are our Bone Spring Shale production, with our Sugarloaf here, initially being Wolfcamp A Bone Spring in the first round, and then definitively Bone Spring after that. And here's our two southerly wells, the Yadin State and the 18 DYK1H. And these are our mixed fluids. These are our A and Ds. And I could, if the desire took me, define end members for this and determine what the geologic mixing was. It's debatable whether it would add anything. And because visualization of this can be quite difficult, this is playing about with the core results, particularly for an upwelling signature. So the core is here. And then because TVD depths vary, you have to move it about ever so slightly in terms of where you place them. But these are our Wolfcamp A fluids. These are our Bone Spring 2 fluids with Sugarloaf 1H up here moving. Our Wolfcamp B, our Wolfcamp C, and here's our Yadin State and 18 DYK, so slightly offset from the rest, with our Wolfcamp B coming in. So there's a huge amount of power you can learn from reservoir geochemistry. You can understand sources and mixing and where the best place to stick your wells are and which you should maybe either take offline or rework how you're going to proceed. Contributions can be done. They can provide information. How useful it is, again, depends on the questions, and that may be the most difficult part of any study. What are your questions? What are your objectives? What can you get out of it? And for those wishing to do further reading and to show that I like to cover everyone, there's a whole bunch of papers. And actually, this talk is based upon a paper which we've been invited to give for minerals, which is rather an odd journal, but it's open access, and they must be trying to branch out. But all the stuff I've talked about here is going to be in a paper with Katie Donoghue, John and Alex Zumberg in the fall. We've also got papers in time-lapse geochemistry from ConocoPhillips' work. Ken Peters has done a huge amount in terms of statistics on mixing conventional fluids. And then I like this paper because it talks about heterogeneity and migration, things you have to understand, and implications for that, what that means for your geochemical work. So thank you for everyone who has managed to stay with me for my talk, and I guess I'll take any questions which may have been compiled.
Alrighty, great presentation. Thank you so much, Craig. So we did get a couple of questions that came in. The first one that came in was, for a time-lapse study for a single well, would it be possible to see changes in the drained rock zone over time?
It's a tad problematic. I mean, you can look at a single well and you can assume that if you have changes through time, it's going to tell you something. It depends how big those changes might be. Basically, it's feasible. Again, it'll come down to context. It's where the well has landed, what information you have available, and how much that shift is that's taking place. We've done it in the past, but it's not often asked for. It's a rarity to get one well.
Alrighty, thank you. The next thing we had was really just kind of, I think, a bit of a kind of feedback in terms of seeing that, you know, couldn't agree more with everything that was said, and some folks are spending more than they have chasing after extracts and also exclusively using only biomarkers. And then the next question we had was, If core is not economically worthwhile, what other data should be considered when planning a regional study?
So our preference is to get as much information as possible. I don't want to come across as saying core is useless, and I hope that isn't what we ended up with. I hope we ended up with use it appropriately in what you do, but it's not the be-all and end-all. Given that this is these are production studies, what we really ask for in many cases is production information. If you have, although that's really dealing with once you've got your acreage, before you get your acreage, the more information you can get or find on the geochemistry, the different zones, the different potential, the better. And there are numerous databases and information and papers out there which can assist with that. Once you've got it, if core is of limited interest, produced oils are king, so work with them. What information you can provide from production and development and geology, and even where your laterals are. We quite often get the reports which give us all the information on the lat long and depth of the laterals, which we can plot up. And when we have the geochemistry information, if we see slight differences, changes, or relationships, we can look and see how those laterals perhaps are related to one another underground. And it can be very useful. And we have a big study doing that at the moment.
And then we've got, so do we lose geochemical markers at higher maturities? And if so, what is the maximum thermal maturity that you would recommend pursuing, using to pursue an oil geochemistry study?
So there is always value in an oil geochemistry study. Never, whether the thermal maturity is 0.7 or 1.3. I'm trying to think of the highest thermal maturities I've seen where I've worked on fluids, because there's always other data you can work with. I mentioned QQQ earlier, which is GC, mass spectrometry, and that's really non-traditional biomarkers, and you can use that to largely replace what you would do with traditional biomarkers and trying to understand what's going on. What you always have to bear in mind is you want like-for-like comparison. So if you're going to use the QQQ and the high-res GC to try and characterize and separate your fluids, then you would want to use that across the board. You're not going to want to shift between the data. But one thing bearing in mind is if you have big thermal maturity variations within your target zone, you're going to end up with a situation where you're going to see a huge amount of variation between the oils, which may be coming from the same source. And I didn't show some of those slides, but if you have lower maturity oils, you can correlate them, and you can start going in and looking at the offsets and relationships between those higher maturity oils back to the lower ones. And generally, you can see the trend off of them. So you can tie back, but you can be a tad more limited. But there's always value in that information. So I would encourage an oil geochemistry study up into condensates, if that happens to be what you have.
Great, sounds great. And then the next one, do you recommend combining water geochemistry with oil geochemistry to verify mixing?
I have seen some great success with oil geochemistry. I have seen some less successful water geochemistry work. It comes down to not only the information you're getting in the samples that are coming out, but also the fluids which are going in. And in many cases, a lot of the people we work with, the fluids which are going down, the waters which are going down, are actually also the same waters that are coming up. And if you don't have a good understanding on whether this is definitively the produced fluid or a mix of the produced fluid and the frac fluid and the likes, you end up tying yourself in knots. We have done a lot of time-lapse studies with waters, and you certainly see relationships. And if there are discrete compartments, it can provide good insight into what's going on. you're producing the oils, so I would always say the oils are number one. If you can collect waters, it can be interesting. Same with gases. If you can collect gases and you have discrete compartments, it could be interesting. Gases are much more mobile than oils, so it can tell you if you're starting to get ingress and mixing much earlier.
Next question was, are the wells drilled with oil-based mud? And if they are, how do you correct the data obtained from the core?
So with core samples, what we usually do, in fact, it's what we would recommend across the board, is we take the center cut of the core, so we avoid anything towards the outer rim. So our hope should be that there is no oil-based mud in there. And if you do have some, it'll show up in the GC quite readily. So that's the way we get round it. So we don't actually correct for it. We just make sure we don't have it. Because correcting for oil-based mud and cuttings, for example, is extremely difficult and problematic in how you end up with what you get. What's something else I was going to say on the core there? We also do TOC pyrolysis before extraction and then after extraction to see if there's any suppression of the S2 signature, and so we have a better understanding of the thermal maturity. That's not necessarily related to OBM, related to other factors as well, but that would be essentially some sort of correctional process that we do.
Makes total sense. And then, do you use CSIA for that kind of analysis? I'm not sure exactly what kind of analysis that referred to.
So we are set up for compound-specific isotope analysis. We have, and actually for the Delaware study, I ran some CSIA samples from the different target zones. The results were a tad mixed. The bone springs separated nicely, but the Wolfcamp A and Wolfcamp B showed much more overlap. What would be extremely useful, and something we've not tried, would be to focus CSIA on the gasoline range compounds, along with some of the more heavier isoprenoids, and say deal with toluene, benzene, NC6, NC7, and see what that data tells you about relationships. But I've never actually found the time to move forward with that project, even though I always get reminded to do so. So it has potential, but again, it's going to be very basin specific. There's certain basins where the similarities and the isotopic signatures of the fluids are so similar. That's not really going to help you with your separation. There are other better ways of doing it.
Sounds good. Thank you. And one final question that we've got is, do you believe this proprietary data should eventually be given to a state agency to enhance or enlarge your statistical sample?
So Geomark's a database company, so that might be slightly problematic. In an ideal world, yes, that would happen, and we could enhance academic assessment and academic studies of this type of data. The problem is it's difficult enough for us to be able to essentially buy proprietary data from the operators, and certainly in some of the more interesting or developing areas, operators will not share that data. So no matter what you do, you're going to have limitations in what's accessible, and more than likely it may get released, say 10 years from now, so you're going to be dealing with data which is not outdated, but it's not at the forefront, and that's probably when academics would maybe be able to get access to, or I mean even beyond academics. I suppose if it went into say a USGS database, everyone would be able to access that. So my answer there is ideally, but I don't see it happening.
That's fair. All right. Well, that is all of our questions that we have. Thank you again for presenting. That was a great presentation. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. Like I said, we will be sending out a survey at the end of this, sometime probably later today or tomorrow, just to get some feedback on kind of the setup and how the actual platform worked. But thank you all again for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Barrie, for giving your talk. We'll hopefully see you back here next month for another technical luncheon.
Thank you, everyone.